good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Ben Wildavsky and Sarah Allen. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of nearly 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for a few introductions. Ben Wildavsky is the author of the 2023 book, The Career Arts, Making the Most of College Credentials and Connections. He hosts the Higher Ed Spotlight podcast and is a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. His decades of experience in journalism and education policy include leadership and research roles at Strata Education Network, the Brookings Institution, the Kauffman Foundation, and U.S. News and World Report. He is the award-winning author of The Great Brain Race, How Global Universities Are Reshaping the World, and co-editor of Reinventing Higher Education and Measuring Success, with bylines in many national magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post. Sarah Allen is the incoming president of the Valhalla Foundation, with her tenure starting in January of 2024. Ms. Allen will lead Valhalla's people and strategy to drive meaningful and measurable improvement in outcomes in Valhalla's 6 issue areas. They are early childhood development, K-12 education, data science, environmental innovation, medical research and talent, and collaborative philanthropy. Now let's welcome Ben Wildavsky and Sarah Allen.
Well, thank you, Lonnie. Hi, Ben. How are you? Good to see you.
Hi, Sarah. Great to be here. Great to be at FAN.
Yes, we are super excited. Thank you so much to FAN for having us in this incredible lineup. It's a great honor to be with you all tonight and really excited about the conversation. So in my former role that I'm just transitioning out of at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I oversaw our efforts in a program area we call Education Pathways, which is really focused on supporting young people in this incredibly important transition from youth to adulthood as they think about their paths after high school, through post-secondary and into career. And so when Ben came to us with a proposal around this idea of this book, I was really intrigued by how he might encapsulate a lot of the research and evidence around what really matters for young people as they look forward in their pathways in our time. And now I'm even more excited to be able to read the book and talk to you about it tonight, Ben. So why don't we just start off with you telling us, what do you mean by the career arts? What's underneath that title, and what are the components of that you think are the most powerful things that families and educators need to be aware of?
Well, let me just start by saying again, I really am so pleased to be in conversation with you, Sarah, and to be at FAN. You know, one of the things, of course, I aspire to, you know, I am an author of a new book, is to reach multiple audiences, you know, and I've already spoken to, you know, a university audience and a think tank audience, and I have a business audience scheduled next week, but I really, really want to talk to schools, parents, guidance counselors, and students themselves. So to have the opportunity to be at FAN, you know, which brings some of those key audiences together, is just a great honor. So thank you for that. And, you know, for the career arts, I mean, you know, there's a quick answer and there's a little bit of a longer answer where I sort of lay out, you know, kind of what brought me to this work. Would you like me to start with the fast one, or would you like me just to go into a little bit about what brought me here?
Why don't you just dive right in? Tell us your pathway to this idea.
Sure. Well, so something's been puzzling me for a long time. I'm going to tell you what it is. Honestly, you know, for our audience, if you follow the news or if you just talk to friends and family, you've probably heard this already. In huge numbers, Americans worry about the value of college. And there's so much skepticism that there's now a big campaign to get rid of degree requirements for many state government and corporate jobs. The idea is, you hear this all the time, is to hire based on skills, not degrees, which are often presented as a barrier instead of a gateway to opportunity. Now, look, most people go to college to get good jobs and to get ahead in life. You know that. And with rising tuition and student debt and critics complaining about cancel culture and classes that are irrelevant to real life, I guess it's natural for Americans to wonder whether they will get good ROI on their investment in college. But the reason this puzzles me, and which really I try to describe in the book, is that to me, the data and the evidence are actually very clear. You know, a record number of Americans have 4-year degrees, And they're earning way more money than people who only graduated from high school. And if you look at what employers really do, instead of what they say, they still have a strong preference for hiring people with degrees. So, this really leads to this important question of what's behind the skepticism. Why are people so uncertain about whether college is worthwhile? And I think, a clue to why people are skeptical is not about college itself, but it's because they're unsure about what they're really going to need in a changing economy. A lot of us are really wondering, what do students need for successful careers? And that's really what I try to explore in the book. And I'll just tell you about it really briefly. Before we get into the key points of the career arts, I also want to just emphasize that all the skepticism I mentioned about college, it's not just something people are telling pollsters in surveys. College enrollment is plummeting. It's down 8% in just 3 years from 2019 to 2022. And it's reached the point where there's now this big push I mentioned to have states and private employers hire based on skills rather than relying so much on degrees. And, this ties into this kind of popular view that I write about, that there is somehow some kind of a fundamental trade-off between pure academics and job relevant skills. In other words, do we need more philosophers or more welders? And I really think that before we reject college in favor of practical skills, we have to look at what's behind this worldview. And I really want to suggest, to you and in the book, I talk about this, that all these changes in public sentiment aren't really about college per se. They're about the desire for job satisfaction and financial success over the long term in a changing economy. And when people say they're worried about degrees, I think what they're really worried about is building a secure career. And so, of course, this leads to what are the core factors in career success? And to answer that, I think that we really fundamentally have to get rid of a sort of one-dimensional view of what it takes to succeed. We have to look at the big picture. And that's actually why I called my book The Career Arts, not the liberal arts, although I love the liberal arts. I was a comparative lit major, back in the day. Not the vocational arts, although targeted skills definitely have their place, but the career arts, because this is about how individuals can put together the right mixture of ingredients to prosper professionally over the long term. And those ingredients, I think, fall into 3 main categories, which are outlined in the subtitle of my book, Making the Most of College, Credentials, and Connections. I argue that what people need for lifelong professional success today are those 3 things: broad education, targeted skills, and social capital. So I'm going to just briefly talk about what I go into much more detail about in the book, which is why each of these 3 elements is important. But I also would really like to have people kind of join me in seeing how they all fit together, something like a balanced diet for a healthy career. And, I think it's usually best to sort of think about these things, not from a theoretical point of view. I'm not a traditional academic at all, a former journalist, but to look at how things actually work in the real world, which for our purpose means the job market. And so that's where I want to just start briefly talking about what employers really need. And, when I began the book, I was really struck by this big study that I came across that came out a few years ago from the labor market analytics firm Burning Glass Technologies. And this study looked at something very interesting: the mixture of technical and creative thinking that's required by a growing number of what they call hybrid jobs. And hybrid jobs combine right brain social skills and left brain technical skills. And this study found much faster growth in those jobs than in other kinds of jobs. And get this, it also found these hybrid jobs that, let's say they combine advertising and data science skills, they pay much more. And, we also know that when employers hire, they very consistently prize qualities like the ability to work on a team, problem-solving skills, and of course, written and verbal communications. So what does that mean? It means we have to move away from a kind of either-or approach to degrees or vocational training, and instead toward a both-and education that really covers both broad and targeted skills. That's what the labor market is asking for. So, okay, we have to take this both-and approach, but you could certainly ask reasonably, what does it mean for educational and career planning? And, for one thing, it means we shouldn't leap to the conclusion that a very technically focused college degree is the most useful kind. Specific skills like computer languages are very useful, no question, but they have what is considered a fairly short half-life. I think back to, in the dark ages, I took an intro to computer science class in college. I learned how to program very basic stuff in the computer language called BASIC. But I'm pretty sure that by the time I graduated, or certainly within a few years later, that was no longer being used much. So it's really important to have the broad transferable abilities that help you learn new things and navigate change. And of course, you also need to find out about what jobs are available. And you need to have a network of people who can not only tell you about opportunities, but who can vouch for your abilities. So to touch on each of those in order, just briefly, college, credentials, and connections. I'll start with college. And the first point I want to make, and I really think it cannot be overstated, is that despite all the angst, despite all the chatter that we hear about college degrees being overrated, there really remains a massive base of evidence for their economic benefits. Despite rising tuition, despite worries about student debt, college graduates still earn an average of 75% more each year than their peers with just a high school diploma. So it would be very natural to ask why. And my fundamental answer in the book is it's really because degrees provide a package. It's a package of these broad and targeted skills. So that's degrees, but what about the second leg of the stool, the non-degree credentials? The first thing to say, and I think you know this very well, Sarah, is that for these kinds of alternative credentials, we really need them. There's a lot of demand for these alternatives to college, but the landscape is very confusing. How can potential students separate the wheat from the chaff, figure out what's good and what's not? And then finally, of course, we know that mixing targeted skills and broad education, even when you do it right, when you get everything right, it's only part of the story. And that really gets to the third ingredient of career success, which is social capital. And social capital is defined as the ability to access and mobilize networks. And if you're trying to build a career, networks are vital. It's certainly no surprise that for people who grow up without a lot of advantages, this is a particular challenge. And that includes low-income job seekers and includes first-generation college students. But the good news is building social capital really can be done successfully. So where does all this add up to? Just briefly, when I put together all these pieces, what I call the career arcs, I think back to this paradox that I started with, which is that Americans are conflicted about college. Many embrace it, but there are also many who distrust it and they want more alternatives. So part of the solution is for a lot more people to move away from a one-dimensional view and instead to look at this big picture. And that's those three main components that I talked about: broad skills, targeted skills, and networks. Looking forward, I think we're going to see many more higher ed institutions that are adopting this both-and approach in what they offer students. And in fact, some of them already are, and we may talk about that. And yes, we do need more high-quality non-degree pathways, but we really should avoid sounding a premature death knell for the degree. It really has to be both and. If we put together college, credentials, and connections, we can ensure that students are truly prepared, not just for the jobs of the future, but for a whole new world of future careers. We definitely have a lot of challenges. I mean, the higher ed system, challenges are not lacking. But I really think this is fundamentally an optimistic message. And I'm really excited to see what happens next. And I just am very, very looking forward to hearing your questions and what your thoughts are on all this.
Well, thank you for that overview. That was really comprehensive and a helpful jumping off point. Well, why don't we go back to the component parts for a second? And let's talk about the college piece and this idea of the value of college. I think it does still feel, I think, very confusing to a lot of young people, their families, even teachers and counselors, how to help young people navigate to something that will, in fact, have a payoff. Because even though broadly a degree is worth it, that's not necessarily 100% true of the time, especially if you pay very high tuition, you don't finish your degree. Obviously, that is a real negative. And then maybe the navigation after the degree is challenging, and it doesn't necessarily set you up immediately to get a great job. And so that can feel really daunting. So where should young people, their families, and others who help them turn to get better information on how to understand within this broad idea that you should go to a post-secondary pathway, which ones are going to be the best for you and really give you that value? It seems like pretty confusing for a lot of people.
Well, look, it is confusing. And I think, one answer is to sort of to keep in mind just the broad principles, which is, it isn't a quick fix. It's funny. I mean, this came up in the context of There's a big debate in Washington, D.C., where I'm based about short-term Pell and what should be eligible. And I don't really get into weighing in too much on that. It's not really a policy book. But a woman named Amy Leighton, who is the education director at New America, a think tank, she has a great line, which I quote in the book, where she says, it's like 5-minute abs. Everybody wants 5-minute abs, but 5-minute abs isn't a thing. And in a way, I think that's what people have to avoid is some of the kind of quick fix approaches. Now, look, I'm very sympathetic to the students and parents and people who are trying to give them advice, but I think you need to think about this mixture of what are you interested in? What do you want to learn more about? What sort of mixture of skills do you want to acquire? But again, I think it's got to have some confidence that the broad skills, even though they might sound a little vague, but any of us who've been in the workforce, know that being able to read and synthesize information and being able to communicate it to others, whether it's in writing, whether it's orally, being able to work with people in groups, all of those, which aren't something you go, for a 6-week boot camp for, those are really important. That said, yeah, by all means, if you love coding, do a lot of coding and just be prepared that, your life is probably going to be some mixture of those kinds of very important technical skills, but a bunch of other skills. Now, that doesn't really get to maybe what you're really asking is, maybe this, 20 years ago, I was the editor of the U.S. News and World Report College Guides. And, I have a lot of war stories, but I think whatever you think about those particular rankings, and I'm certainly not here to defend every detail of what they do, but I do very much believe that consumers need information. I believe that old expression, knowledge is power. Accountability really is important. So there is now, for example, it's very much, I call it a work in progress, but the US Department of Education has this college scorecard. It's on a government website. There's lots of discussion about how to make it more user-friendly and more accessible, whether it's measuring everything exactly right. There is no single perfect tool, partly because this is an individual basis. It's an individual thing. Some people are going to do great starting off in community college, but it's really important for them to try and keep their eye on the ball and to, if they plan to transfer to a 4-year school, to really stick to that plan, because we know there's a huge disconnect between the high numbers who aspire to start at community colleges and transfer, who never end up doing it. There's now, it goes back to one of your early points, there's now a huge number of people, it's 40 million plus Americans with some college, no degree, according to the most recent figures from the National Student Clearinghouse. And that reflects the fact that a lot of people started down the path and for all kinds of reasons, maybe didn't get the support they need, had financial problems. And really, in some ways, the big reason for a lot of people is life gets in the way. A lot of people don't have that life where they put everything aside to go off to a sylvan small town somewhere and be in a little ivory tower community. That just isn't the reality for many college students, but that does not mean, we should give up on all those who don't fit the model. I think the model has to be more flexible and expand, and people do need a lot of different kinds of support. And of course, this is what one of the things you spend a lot of time on, so you know all about this.
That's right. Well, I think a good example you highlighted in the book is how some institutions are actually starting to create this kind of both-and structure. And often they are the ones that have started in that 2-year space, where, community college is this really important bridge between, many people on various times in their kind of career pathway, whether it's coming out of high school or later, going back. And you highlight Colorado Mountain College, for example, as an institution that is putting together the pieces differently to allow there to be multiple ways for people to navigate to opportunity. Can you say a little bit more about what it looks like when an institution really takes those 3 ingredients seriously and tries to help whoever's coming in the door get where they need to go?
Yeah. Colorado Mountain College, it's called CMC. It's one of my favorite examples. I use it all the time. It's one of about 40 what they call dual mission institutions around the country. And in a way, I think to think about it is it's a bit of a hybrid between a community college and a 4-year school. They have campuses around, I believe it's approximately 11 sort of mountain communities in Colorado. So they have everything from people, who've already have degrees and maybe have had a career somewhere else, who've got a second home and are looking to get into something new. Maybe they want to be a river guide or a mountain guide or something, and they need to learn about, say, avalanche science. They also have law enforcement officers, police officers who need to get some credentials. They have teachers who need a bachelor's degree. So Carrie Hauser, the president, told me that they really they kind of take they have a bunch of liberal arts options, but they also have a bunch of much more targeted options, and they kind of smush them all together under one roof in one institution. And I think that's not going to work for every institution. They're a very distinctive funding model. They are trying to meet the particular needs of their communities. But I think that it's just an interesting insight that I don't think that students care that much about the silos between whether it's a 4-year or even a PhD granting school or whether it's a community college. They just want to get certain kinds of, again, that's the broad and the targeted. And, one of the things that I think I quote Carrie Hauser on this in the book is, there might be somebody who wants to be a river guy, or they're working in a local business. So they need that particular skill, but they also need to be able to market the business to prospective clients. They may need to be able to do spreadsheets. They may need to be able to set up a website. There are lots of things that go into this. So you could tell yourself, oh, it's a very targeted specialty, but it's also some slightly broader, much broader abilities. And they really try and provide that so that depending on what phase of life someone is in, just coming out of school or mid-career, whether they're looking for something that requires licensure, a very practical thing, or whether they just want to be more effective at running a business, all those options are on the table at a school like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the fact of the matter is, for high school students, that the decision to make a huge investment in a 4-year program just may not be practical for many families. And to have an option where you can go and get a first credential or a good ways towards a credential at a place like Colorado Mountain College, maybe with some real work experience woven in, that's going to set you up to have multiple options, whether it's to transfer to a BA or go right into the labor market. So those institutions that are providing those kinds of options seem pretty important in today's labor market.
Absolutely. And in fact, where I thought you were kind of going, and maybe you want to get to this later, but the whole notion of, it's a little bit of a wonky term. But of course, I love hanging out with policy wonks, and I think it's important is what's called stackable credentials.
Right.
And that is, I think it's one of the scenarios that would work with some of the CMC credentials, but there are many other schools too that are starting to think more seriously about this. And what that really means is, this in some ways is an important takeaway, I think, in general, for making decisions about if you are looking for a non-college credential. There are some that can be a pathway where they can set you up for better jobs, raises, promotions, more educational opportunities. And there are some that are much more of a dead end. And the way to make it much more of a pathway is to look for the sort of options that can be combined and stacked up on top of each other, maybe not at the same time. A lot of people, as there's the sort of new majority in higher ed is working adults, many of them that have kids and family responsibilities. They're busy. They're not going to be able to put everything aside for the 4 years of a traditional degree, but they might be able to go and get some kind of a targeted training, perhaps with support from their employers. We can talk about that. That's a big growing movement of employer-provided education. That's one of my takeaways in the book, is you've got to really take advantage of that. But you can take a class, get some skills, maybe take it online, maybe take an evening when you have time. Maybe you can get a raise, maybe you can get a promotion. But then you're busy, and maybe 2 years later, a year later, then like your kid has started school, your kid has graduated high school, and you got a little more time. Then you go back for a second targeted credential, and they can be combined, and eventually you can get an associate's. Maybe you can get a 4-year degree. So I think it's just really important for us to think about how things fit together, and it's important for colleges to kind of embrace that possibility, so that they're hurting for enrollment right now. But I think one way to grow is to you don't have to give up your essence as an academic institution. I think that's it's a misconception, but I do think you have to find a way to meet students where they are and offer them stuff that's going to get them in the door and that's going to help them improve their lives.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that's really been helping this enrollment challenge, particularly for 2-year colleges, is dual enrollment, helping high schoolers actually start on their post-secondary pathway while still in high school and make a meaningful kind of move towards that first credential, which is something we've been supporting a lot. And I think is really an exciting development, not just taking one-off courses, but actually starting on a coherent program of study that is organized maybe around a career area. And, when we talk to young people, a lot of young people actually want to make sure they see where they're headed next. You know, it does feel uncertain out there. They want to make sure that what they're going to do is going to lead to a good job. And by starting early in high school and starting to feel what that feels like and starting to meet people in that profession and have some experiences through that higher education, early college work that exposes them to what is this really about, helps them make better decisions, and also ultimately maybe also build that third leg of your stool, connections. So maybe talk a little bit more about that, because, you know, I think people, when they hear connections, they think about like every individual having to go network and figure out their own connections, and that's a part of it. But there are other things that institutions and other organizations can do to actually really foster the development of connections and networks. You've got a couple of examples of those in the book. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it is important. And I mean, there's so much to be said about this. This is actually one of the, in working on the book, I've been writing about higher ed for many years, but the whole idea of this networks and social capital really was something I had not, just had not focused on until a few years ago. I got to know Ame Eubanks Davis, who is this tremendous woman who is the founder of Braven, which works with mostly first generation low income college students, trying to get them into really strong first jobs, because there's a lot of evidence that that really helps improve the trajectory. And it turns out that, you know, of course, the degrees and the credentials are important, but it's kind of like they're necessary but not sufficient, because that you do need to plug those degrees and those skills into networks through all the things I've mentioned, to find out what's out there, and also to have someone who, you know, Ame likes to say, it's not just who you know, it's who knows you. And that may be because you had a part-time job, or you had an internship, or you met someone in college. I think that those are things that that really help you. But so to get to your specific point about what colleges are doing, there's a lot of variety. And I think, to be honest, I cannot say they're all hitting it out of the park. You know, I think there are a lot of missed opportunities. There's some survey research from Strata. It's now called Strata Education Foundation, my former employer. And they have some interesting research also cited in the book that talks about how, if you survey college graduates about what they wish they'd had more of in college, there's fairly high numbers. And in general, people would have liked more networking help. And that's particularly true of first gen college students, who are the ones who particularly need that. Now, in terms of the specifics, it really kind of runs the gamut. You know, there are some examples that I talk about in the book. I mean, a little college, a liberal arts college in Ohio, Kenyon College, which has created one journalist who wrote about this talked about it as, it's kind of like one of those maps in the back of airline magazines that shows you all their routes. In this case, it shows you where all their graduates go. So you might say, oh, Kenyon, you know, it's a high quality small liberal arts college, but you know, what good are those degrees for any kind of jobs? Well, it shows you. It makes it very visual about where the graduates have gone. Or there's a place, you know, in California, in San Diego called Point Loma Nazarene College, small liberal arts school, a lot of first gen students. They have created kind of major maps so that students who major in a particular field, and then there's a lot of, not just the students, but their first generation families who are a little bit wary of like, what's my kid gonna get from this school? But you can show them, you know, maybe you major in like a basic science like biology, but you're also doing all the liberal arts stuff, because that's what happens at most colleges to some degree. But there's a thriving biotech industry in San Diego, so you can study a core science and you can get a job. And also, those jobs aren't all lab science. You know, it doesn't mean you have to be a brilliant researcher. You know, they have people who do marketing and sales and all kinds of other things. So I think part of the job is to, and there's a lot of talk about this in the career services world, is to students and their families have a very natural interest in connecting classroom to career. And I think there are some faculty, you know, who historically, or maybe, you know, maybe this is an understatement, a little change averse or a little wary of things coming from the outside being imposed on them. They said, we're not a job training institution. And I think that's fair enough. I mean, I really am a believer in that core mission of universities. I believe, you know, they're there to sort of seek the truth. They're also there to educate students and prepare them for the future. But you don't have to compromise your academic mission simply to recognize and acknowledge that your students have a real hunger for learning about those things. Maybe they want to try out different jobs and find out what they don't like. That's one of the things you get from part-time jobs or summer jobs or internships. But those are all things that colleges and particularly professors who are kind of trusted sources of advice, they can offer some of that just by talking about where people go, the fact that maybe you're studying, statistics, and there's a million different ways that can be. I was a journalist for years. Statistics that I had studied was extremely helpful to me in trying to analyze information, trying not to be irresponsible about survey results or whatever. There's just all kinds of ways, but I think that, again, it comes back to people, particularly who don't have a history, let's say, of college going in their family.
Mhm.
They simply need you to take the sort of unwritten understanding of what this kind of knowledge can be good for, and all those, so like those unwritten rules of how networks get built, and try and make them more transparent, try and make them more explicit so everyone has access to that information.
Yeah, I mean, we've been really influenced by Raj Chetty's research on social capital, and how actually unbelievably important it is as a lever for economic mobility. And one of the things I found fascinating in his research is really how, when you are put into an environment where there are a lot of different kinds of people than you, and you start to form that kind of broader, kind of weak top, to your point, who knows you? Maybe maybe not your best friend, but they know you a bit, they know of you, they know of your institution. That kind of connectivity to a broader range of people, backgrounds, is just this fundamental set of assets that you have that then help propel you forward in the labor market and in life. And it's kind of invisible, but if you don't go to college and you don't put yourself into that kind of environment, you are really cutting off a lot of potential levers to propel you in the labor market going forward. And there are lots of things I think institutions, as you mentioned, can do to foster more connectivity between faculty and students, between the university and employers, between students across different backgrounds and majors, et cetera, that really actually, even though it might seem like extra, is really a very important lever to help every student then really build on that foundation of what they get out of college beyond just the academics. So I appreciate you profiling organizations like Braven, who are really helping colleges do that exact thing, like build both the knowledge, but also the connections, and kind of operate as a sort of support to career services so that those kinds of connections don't just happen by chance, that they're really built into the program, that you get that automatically.
No,
which seems like
absolutely.
it's important.
No,
Yeah.
for sure. And I will just mention quickly, absolutely, this is something that colleges, if they get it right, and they're getting better, but there's a long way to go, can be very important. But I will say that there are also places, I'm thinking of an organization where I did some interviews also in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's an organization called Climb Higher, and they work with people who mostly did not graduate from college. Some of them may have associate's degrees, but they feel like they've gotten kind of into maybe barista type jobs, and again, nothing wrong with that. All kinds of work is honorable and respectable, but people who feel that they're kind of stalled and they don't see a path for upward mobility. And one of the big things that this program does is through all kinds of peer mentoring and coaching, and even what they call near peers, people who come in to talk, who've come up from a similar background, who've gotten into some kind of a good, maybe a Silicon Valley job. They come back and they help work with people. They are convinced that, they do have some hard skills that they might teach in certain, they do Salesforce training, for example, but they're very emphatic. The head of this, the Nitsan Pellman, who's the director, the founder, says, this is not about the skills. If it's just about the hard skills, you can go and take an online class or something. The social networks are absolutely essential. So I say that only just as a PS. Yes, colleges are a way to do it, but it does not only have to be done in college. Again, a place like, I'm thinking about Year Up, which has been a very effective program. Again, some people, I interviewed a guy from the Year Up Washington area, who'd gone to a community college, but he still kind of got stuck. And he just really valued this 1 year of 6 months of training, which was a mixture of sort of, they don't really talk about it so much as social capital, but it's definitely professional skills. Mm-hmm. When I went to visit the program in downtown DC, right near Capitol Hill, this was just in the post-COVID era. People were just starting to go back into offices, and they were all wearing business clothes. That's what they do for their weekly meetings. They all were giving a kind of report to the group about what they had been doing in their, in one of their classes. I think they were getting sort of socialized into what this kind of professional responsibility and behavior is. And then the second half, of course, is they do these 6 month they get a small stipend, which is important for these students. They get a paid placement, internship placement, and then they really focus a lot on what they call the conversion rate, which is, do you go from getting the 6 months of training and mentoring and peer support and hard skills and sort of soft skills to going to the job, but then do you get hired full time? And they keep careful track of that because that's a big win, right? Because that tells you that they're doing their job and it makes them incredibly valuable to students, and they have a very good conversion rate. So I think that there are definitely multiple. Again, you don't want to be starry-eyed. Not every program is a poster child for perfection and success, but there really are people who've done this, and I think that the challenge is just to get more people to see how useful this is, and that we focus, I think, correctly on things like graduation rates and getting them up, but the whole notion of what is the mixture of supports that you need: navigation help, coaching, getting to the finish line so you don't become one of those 40 million some college no degree. That takes a lot of effort.
It does. But I think what you're pointing out is that these types of experiences build a set of skills that can completely be taught no matter what your background is. And even high schools can, through pathways programs, can help young people start to understand what it's like to, have that set of professional skills, to be able to advocate for yourself, to be able to present yourself well, to build relationships. And that's actually part of what adults do who are, successful in their careers. And it's not too early to start doing that in high school. And that's something that a lot of high schools are starting to do through their CTE programs and other things like that. So really important stuff. I want to go back to the credentials, the non-degree credentials piece. And, in my work, and the programs at the Gates Foundation, for example, we've stuck really strongly to the idea that for young people, coming out of high school, the least risky paths really are to go to a two-year or four-year program and to get a degree, because we don't have yet evidence from the labor market that a 17 or 18-year-old or 19-year-old can just go to a short-term credential and actually be on a path to a thriving career. That, as you mentioned, that those credentials are better as add-ons either to a skill base you've developed through work or a college degree. Can you just say a little bit more about, like, what are we starting to know about the value of credentials that aren't degrees, and who are they really for? Because I think there's a myth out there that you could just opt into something like that after high school and you're on your way. And so far, the evidence around that is pretty murky.
Yeah, I mean, look, in general, one of the challenges, honestly, talking to researchers, is that there isn't a really great comprehensive, there is an organization called Credential Engine, a nonprofit that does an annual report. It finds more than 1 million different kinds of credentials in the US, and more than 3/4 of those are non-college degree credentials. So there's a huge universe of stuff out there, but it's not like we have, some people think, I think this is on balance probably good, but some people think we should have a Ministry of Education or a sort of centralized office. That isn't how the US works. So we don't have one body kind of tracking everything. So some people will say it's the Wild West, which is a little pejorative, but probably kind of true. There's just a lot out there. So look, what I can tell you is one of the best pieces of research I found was from an organization called JPAL, which is at MIT. It's a very respected research group. And actually an economist at Harvard, Larry Katz, who's a very distinguished labor economist, participated in this study, which was what they call sectoral credential programs. And so these are non-degree programs, but that are basically, they've done a pretty rigorous evaluation of how effective they are in terms of raising wages, and raising wages, not just like an initial bump, but having some sort of stickiness to that improved, wage base. And they looked at basically some combination of in-demand fields, which would include things like, financial services or healthcare or computer science, of course, always comes up. It also includes, though, some training in those very specific skills, but also some broader kind of career skills, which I would go into that, back to that broad and targeted part I was talking about. But they really are just, they're careful, I think, to say that this is not something that, it's not automatically that because you're going into like an in-demand field that you're automatically good. Another example, which actually I heard from Joe Fuller, who's at the Harvard Business School, who's very involved in looking at a lot of workforce issues, is you can go to Bunker Hill Community College in the Boston area, and you can do a certificate program basically that qualifies you in sort of computer skills to become an IT help desk technician. And it leads to a very significant salary bump compared to average sort of graduate salaries. And it leads you to a real sort of sequence of better jobs in the sector. So it's a pretty decent bet, if you're going to do something short-term, pretty affordable. But you can go to Bunker Hill Community College, same community college, and you can do a kind of, I think it's a nursing assistant. I may not have the exact name, but one of those kind of healthcare professions where there's a lot of demand and it's a fairly common community college product. But basically, it's kind of, I think he or someone else described it as a bit of an island. It's like, it sort of is a dead end. It doesn't go someplace. You can't really easily build on it without a lot more school to get ahead. So I think that in general, you just have to be very careful about looking at what you're going to. And there's, a lot of the patterns that we see, as we see this in other parts of higher education, but New America, the think tank, did some research about non-degree credentials often being certainly less, having much less of a wage premium than college degrees, and being disproportionately a place where lower income students go, Black and Latino students go. To some extent, women are more likely to go to these lower paying kinds of credentials. And that's a real challenge. And it's one of the reasons why I really worry a lot about, and I just, again, discuss this in the book, the idea that degrees are sort of there's so much skepticism that degrees are being sort of held out as an obstacle to progress for like Black and Latino students because fewer of them have degrees. So therefore, to me, the answer is, well, okay, so there's like there's a lack of, education and what they call human capital. So the solution is to give those people more human capital. But instead, there's been a whole kind of narrative that like degrees are kind of the enemy. They're standing in the way. So let's have them do more of these accessible short-term credentials. But guess what? Those credentials are very de facto. They're kind of segregated by race and class. The better paying ones tend to be more affluent, more white students attracted to those. So I really feel like there's a real risk that trying to sort of feel like those credentials are kind of an escape valve for less advantaged students that are going to help them. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think I would much rather, yes, we have a lot of problems with degree programs, but like let's mend it, don't end it. Like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use two kind of different cliches, but still they're both true. I think that's what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all of us who work in education or in adjacent areas, in HR, other things, we just have to be careful. Like, I like to think of that sort of personal test. Like, would I want my kid to do this program? Is this, and if you can't answer that question for yourself, or would you do it, then you shouldn't necessarily be thinking that, well, there's a certain group of children that would benefit from that. I mean, that may be true, but it's always an important gut check to not be defaulting into certain patterns for certain kids, because that may be actually recreating the sort of vocational tracking of old and things like that did in fact make it really predictive who got to be in college and who went to other things, and based on race and zip code, gender, and we want to make sure we're breaking those patterns down.
Look, I mean, and I'll be honest, Sarah, I mean, more than I do about the high school CTE programs. I absolutely believe, and it's certainly in dual enrollment can be very well done. It's not always well done. It depends who the instructor is, and is it really a college level instructor, or is it sort of a high school teacher who got deputized? There are some questions there, but my main concern about when people start talking about we need more like CTE in high schools is, sure, yes, if done well, but there really is a long history of the bad old days. And frankly, I think this is even true in other countries. People talk a lot about the German apprenticeship model, but kids are really sort of sorted at age maybe 12. Back before about 1970 in the UK, there was this test called the 11 plus, and you took that test when you were 11 years old, and you were either a clever kid who went to what they call the grammar school, which were the selective schools, or you went to a secondary modern, which was sort of for all the leftovers. And I just really feel that, they changed the system there, and, they're doing different things now, but that's always been really kind of antithetical, I think, to the American ethos. And I just worry, it doesn't mean everyone has to go to a four-year college and, read Plato around a seminar table. I mean, that can be great for some people, nothing against, philosophy, But people, I think, have to understand that going to college is not the same as being ready for college. College readiness, I think, is absolutely valuable because there's so many options that you can do after high school that don't involve philosophy around a seminar table for 4 years. And I think people also need to see that college can mean so many different things to different people.
Yeah. Well, and it's encouraging now too, because I think, the education reform, K-12 education sort of reform movement of the last 20 years did have a sort of college for all, 4-year college for all orientation to it. And I think that's starting to really split out now into like the idea of multiple high quality pathways for all. And you even see entities like the College Board, with their Big Futures platform starting to really acknowledge that, there's multiple ways to get on a pathway to college and career. And that's not just 4 years, not just, do these 10 APs and go to a highly selective institution, that there's multiple options there. And so helping young people really feel, what are all the things out there that are happening in the labor market that I might be interested in? And then what is the pathway to that thing, and having the support to figure that out. And so it's encouraging to see that broadening. And, one of the beefs I have is when people talk about college, we all default to thinking we mean 4-year, but there are many, many different kinds of college pathways that do deliver valuable outcomes in the labor market, that we just need to help make sure that information is much more transparent and available to young people so they can make the choice that's going to be best for them.
Absolutely. I mean, look, let's not forget, community college is college. It's a huge slice of undergraduates are at community college, and they often, they could be doing better in some respects. They're complicated institutions with multiple missions, but they really can be a very, very good place for people to figure things out. And then I can't resist just throwing this in, of course, going back to the land grant universities founded in the second half of the 19th century, those were very explicitly set up to be institutions of higher education that met the needs of the country and the learner by doing all kinds of, whether it's agricultural extensions and education and mechanics. If you look at the early names of some of those colleges, they still exist. And if people at those schools, you can still go to Iowa State and major in animal science, but you're also going to take some English and probably maybe some social science or some other liberal arts subjects. You can major, look at the most popular majors in college. It's all 20% of undergrads are doing some kind of business, finance, accounting, marketing, or they're doing, teaching. It's a hugely popular major, or they're doing computer science, et cetera. So this drives me crazy when people talk about like college is, this sort of ivory tower abstract, people always, you can pick on some of the woke stuff, fair enough. I mean, I do think there are some real problems with campus, illiberalism and the need for a healthier free speech environment. But I really think that people kind of lose the narrative when they kind of make college out to be something that it isn't for most people who go. That's
right. Yeah, I think back to a young man I met a couple of years ago at Modesto Junior College in the inner empire in California, and I think he was studying some kind of agricultural technology program, 2-year program. I think he was president of the 4-H club. Another important thing around social capital connection, partnerships with community and employers, and something like 4-H or Future Farmers for America. And then this young man was transferring to Stanford, actually, after his degree. So his 2-year degree was up, and he could now afford to go to Stanford because he already had a credential and he'd been able to work in the summers in a career-oriented profession. And it was just a great example to me around how in every community there are programs that are really tailored to the needs of that community, but that are leading to really awesome pathways where it's transfer or right into, a $60,000 a year job in agricultural technology management track in the, big agriculture. So there's just so many options out there that I think we collectively in the education space need to make sure are visible and valued.
Absolutely, and frankly, I can't resist mentioning. I'm actually, despite my my home office background, that is how my home office looks. But that's not where I am. I'm out in California. I'm at UCLA, where I was speaking at a conference earlier. But I had breakfast with a couple who live nearby in Santa Monica, and they reminded me of how many people go to Santa Monica Community College, and which is well known as a sort of gateway to UCLA or UC Berkeley, and just in general. In California, there's an ethos of very significant use of community college transfer throughout the 4-year system, including to the most elite, most selective flagship schools like Berkeley and UCLA. Maybe 35% of their students are transfer students. And I think that's just an untapped resource, particularly in the post-affirmative action era after the Supreme Court decision, striking down a race-based affirmative action. There's a real opportunity to do a lot more to get students who are often very talented and really have a lot of, they're hungry and they're talented and they're from disadvantaged backgrounds in many cases. And those are, without explicitly taking race or ethnicity into account, if you view those as a resource, I think you can really do well. And I think Berkeley and UCLA have sort of shown that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in California, they have those automatic transfer policies that allow you to know if I'm in this 2-year program, it will automatically, all my credits will follow me. And that is another big challenge in our space. If my credits that I spent money on don't actually follow me into the next stage, then I'm having to, refinance my education. And so that is a barrier that's, I think, slowly coming down. But there are some great examples like California where they've laid that out really clearly. You can go onto the website and know, if I'm in this AA program, it's automatically going to transfer to these 6 programs at these 6, public flagships, et cetera. And that's the kind of information that young people need to make the right choice.
Absolutely.
I mean, you touched on it a little bit, and I think we're going to transition shortly, but, this question of affordability and, the public versus private school, 2-year versus 4-year, it does seem like a pretty critical kind of factor in helping young people figure out what their path should be, is to understand, what is affordable to them, what's going to make it a good return on investment for them, given the starting point of their family. And do you touch on that in the book at all? Because I think, when we talk to young people, this idea that I can't afford college is quite pervasive, and it's pervasive with their parents who may still be paying off student debt. So how do we help people think about affordability in these times, given all these different options?
Yeah, it is something I don't get into a lot of detail about, the financial side of this, although I certainly talk about it as it's the framework for a lot of people's views about college. And I'm pretty sure I did talk about this too, which is, two things are true. There obviously has been a problem with, rising student debt and with the rising tuition, although that has been offset by financial aid. So it's very complicated. Net tuition is actually, in the last 10 years, isn't really up. But for many years, there's been a real challenge, and this is really a big part, if you believe in the sort of college access agenda, there is public perception is not accurate oftentimes. So people overestimate the actual cost of college, the out-of-pocket costs to students and families, and they underestimate the amount of financial aid that's available. And this is a huge problem. So I think that, I wish I told you that there was a simple solution, but I guess I keep on coming back to sort of more information. We obviously have, unfortunately, college counseling staffs are not as robust. In the high schools, there is not as robust counseling and staffing as would be useful. And I think that this is where you need to find people, maybe it's parents, maybe it's, people in, ministers and people in the religious community, the people who are trusted adults, I think, need to find a way. You don't have to deny that college has gotten expensive, but you can also remind people 90% of Americans, go to public, relatively accessible institutions. You read about the Ivies, and we all love to have people who live, in neighborhoods like I live, Chevy Chase, Maryland. There's a very thin slice of people who are all kind of hung up on who gets into these tiny number of schools, but that just is not the reality for most people. And it's not only that you want the kids in those neighborhoods not to get so crazy and stressed out, but you want everyone to understand that, most people don't graduate from college with $200,000 or $300,000 in debt, or even $100,000 in debt. That just is not what's happening. And the much bigger problem, as is people who don't graduate and end up with what they call some college, no degree, which means they have trouble repaying. And if you look at the defaults, there was a great book a few years ago called Game of Loans by Matt Chingos and Beth Akers that talks about this. The defaults are often on amounts of maybe $5,000, $10,000. It's not the kind of $200,000 or $300,000 debt, which, it does exist if people go to med school or business school and vet school. They also make massive salaries to repay it. So I'm still a believer in this sort of, it's become kind of an old-fashioned view, but there is a real economic, it makes a lot of sense to take out a modest amount of debt and also do some part-time work if you can repay it by graduating from college. You don't have money when you're young. You don't have a lot of that human capital economists talk about. You go to college, you get educated, you develop it, and then suddenly you're able to make money and start paying it back, and oftentimes with a 10-year or sometimes a 20-year timeline. That kind of makes sense. The difficulty is that a lot of people have gotten stretched too thin, and there's parents taking on debt as well. So it absolutely is a flawed system, but there is a core to it, which I still think makes a lot of sense for expanding opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you look at those statistics, what you're unpacking is that they're a lot driven by the people who don't complete their credential, unfortunately. And so, what institutions can do, what employers can do to make it easier for folks to stay the course and get that credential. The return, for having the credential is solid, but if you don't get there, that is who gets stuck with like finding it incredibly challenging. So there's a lot of good stuff going on to put the student supports in place to really try to increase those completion rates in all these different kinds of pathways. And that's incredibly important work that will help hopefully millions of young people over time. I see Lonnie coming back on. So thank you. Thanks, Ben. Great to chat.
Oh, well, thank you, Sarah. Such a great conversation.
Yeah, Sarah, I really appreciate the way you ran that interview. It was, sometimes people, I appreciate your active listening skills. How about I put it that way? It definitely carried it through. So I appreciate it. It was Anne-Marie and I were quickly putting in lots of links in chat as you guys were referencing things. So when we push out the recording through the Zoom platform in a day or two, we'll be including many of those links. So people, if they're like, what was that book? What was that thing? What did he say? Which thing? And which brings me to my point. There was a question submitted during the event from Peter. And it was early in the event. So I did not catch what he is referring to. So Ben, I hope you will be able to tell me. He says, what is the study you mentioned about hybrid jobs?
Oh, yes, it's from Burning Glass Technologies. It is, if you Google hybrid jobs and Burning Glass, you'll find it right away. It's now, the only complication is Burning Glass has now been rebranded as Lightcast. So you might find it on the Lightcast website, but I can get you. Okay, good.
Yeah, I just found it. And maybe Anne-Marie, my Zoom producer, will archive that for us because we are running a little short on time here right now. I want to remind folks that both Sarah and Ben will be joining us at after hours at 8:05 p.m. Central in about 5 minutes from now. They will field questions. I hope there's been plenty here to discuss, especially for those of you who are in education, any people involved in high schools, post-secondary education. I'm sure there was a lot here. They gave you a lot to think about and mull, as well as parents, as well as people who are just tuning in and getting a very rich conversation here. Buy a copy of Ben's book, The Career Arts. We've been putting links in chat all along from our partner bookseller, The Bookstall, and that's how you get your access into after hours. Sarah, I want to thank you so much. It was it was great to know you. I'm glad you're part of the fan family. And I look forward to continuing another 55 minutes with you in just a few short minutes. And Ben, you are just a wealth, man. You have it like, bam, it's right at your fingertips. I love all of it. Thank you so much for coming on and giving such a great service to the fan community. Really appreciate it.
Well, I guess I'm part of the fan club now.
You are.
Me too.
You're a
Thanks so
fan.
much. We're big fans of fans.
All right, great. Everybody, thanks for coming.